Well, good Friday afternoon, everyone. To some of you on the West Coast, good Friday morning. Here in Oklahoma, where I'm at, it's 12 noon. And I hope you're having a great day. Hope you're looking forward to having a great weekend. So I appreciate you all being here. Man, I'm looking down the list. We have people from literally around the world. Srikanth from Bangalore makes it around the world. For the rest of you, they're all over the country. Good to see many of you. I consider as friends and clients and people who have been through e-learning. Some of you are just on my email list, and you're also my community there that I try to serve with new content. Some of you, I have your names. Others, I just have phone numbers. But Arvin, Barb, Beth, good to see you here. Chris, great to see you here. One of my certification students. Awesome that you're here. David, Kevin, Kolta. Oh, okay. Kotla is one of my Facebook friends from Hybridad. Great to have you here, Kotla. Also, Margie, Paul, Rose, Steve Rademacher. Hey, man, it's been forever since we've spoken. Great to see you here. Teresa, Tracy. Hi, Violet from Fort Worth. Good friend. Vladimir and Wendy are on the line here. So good to have you guys here. I'm going to be as courteous of your time as I can. I usually like to try to keep these sessions fairly, to that 45-minute mark, allow a little bit of time for questions as we go along. As I popped into the comments window there, if you do have a question or comment, please let me know, and I will unmute your line. Some of you who have dialed in by phone, I believe you can control that on your phone as well. So, but it does kind of help to keep the background noise down. But I will be keeping a chat on the, keep an eye out on the chat to see if there's any questions. Now, I will have these, I'll have both the recording of the session and the slides right after we're done. And the place to go get those is at my blog at randallrice.blogspot.com. If you can't get that down right now, that's okay. I'll mention it again before the end. But also, I typically will put these out at riceconsulting.com. You'll see it on my homepage where it'll take you to basically the same links. Okay, so we'll have both the session recording and the slides so that you can have those. Okay, well, let's get right into this. This concept is one that I've actually used and taught for quite some time, and let me take my picture down here. There we go. I've used this for quite some time, but I've decided to try to document it, and I've called it TestStorming for quite some time too, which is why I've trademarked it. And the thing about it is, as we get into new technologies like mobile and other situations, sometimes what we've used in the past just isn't enough to give us the kinds of tests we need. And so I'm going to present this out there to you as a possible technique that you can take and use and apply. And, I'm not trying to sell anything on this. I don't have a course around it yet. I might in the future develop a course on it. But it's really a pretty simple concept. But, one of the things that I think is really cool to do in any kind of practice is try to combine techniques. And by combining techniques, then many times we get to see even a greater benefit as opposed to just using one of those techniques alone. So I'll get into the effect of combining three techniques in particular to achieve what we're talking about here. But, think about those times when you just don't really have enough time to do what you would think of as traditional test design. And especially, as testers, sometimes we see the same thing over and over again, and it kind of, builds a tunnel vision effect in us. So sometimes we kind of run short of ideas. And those of you familiar with the pesticide paradox that Boris Weiser wrote about will understand that your tests do grow weaker over time because they become tried and true and more confirmatory as opposed to discovery oriented. So if you want to discover defects or perhaps potential defects, then you kind of have to get off the beaten path. You have to think more creatively. And so you need some new ideas sometimes. And another thing too is that we all have limitations to our perspective and to our knowledge about something. And, I've been testing now for, I guess, going over 27 years now. But even when I was a developer, for the 13 years before that, there'd just be times where I realized I had reached the end of my knowledge, and I would have to call in someone else to give me some quick schooling on, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? And we all experience that. Now, if you don't experience that, then I would suggest rethinking how you think, because we do have all limited perspectives. We all have biases. And so we can kind of get some other perspectives. Now, the big thing here, though, is that as much as we like to talk about specification-based testing, requirements-based testing, use case-based testing, user stories, all of that, the reality is we don't really get what we need or even what we want much of the time. It's just not there. And when it is there, many times it's incomplete, it's flawed. And when we take this very sterile idea of going from a document to a test case, that is why validation was invented, okay, was because there's problems with that. Now, don't get me wrong. I love requirements. I love use cases. I love user stories. Any way you can describe something to me, I want to see it. But as I'm going through there, I'm finding vague words. I'm finding untestable items, sometimes incorrect items. So those things have their limitation as well. And so we just have to kind of go into it realizing that. I've never seen a perfect requirement in all my years, almost 35 years now of IT experience. I've just never seen a perfect requirement. I've seen some pretty good ones, but there's always one more thing you could put in there, it seems. And then now you're dealing with bloated requirements. Well, the idea of what's the big deal here with test design? A lot of people try to practice this in a vacuum. Okay, they have a test designer or maybe a few people doing test design, but they tend to, instead of work in teams, they tend to want to work individually. And so you set this person out to design tests for one function and maybe another person to design tests for another application or something. And that kind of becomes their application, and they work on the testing of it. Well, the problem in working in these silos is that, once again, you have the tunnel vision issue, and you just kind of are in this sterile area there where you don't get the good interactions and the good ideas that other people can bring. You combine that with the flawed specifications that I mentioned, and then you have a problem. But something that I've learned over the years, but the more I do test design and the more I teach it, the more I understand that test design is very nuanced. Okay. And what I mean by that is, and this is coming from somebody that teaches this on a very regular basis, textbook approaches will only take you so far. It's only until you start to apply those approaches from a classroom or in a textbook or whatever, in your situation with your applications and your environments, that you will learn that, okay, that technique looked good, but it really doesn't apply all that well in my situation. So there's kind of a fuzziness around how you apply the certain techniques, whether it be boundary value analysis or use case testing or whatever, that makes it not quite that very simple, straightforward transition from, okay, the spec says this, I'm going to test this. So it takes someone with a little experience, and sometimes the team can help in this. They can help make the adjustments. They can help see what might not work, what could be done a little bit differently to make it work better. And a lot of test design, in fact, excuse me, I'm going to check the chat window here real quick. One of the most common things that I hear from people, especially test managers, is that they feel that the testing that their team does lacks rigor. They feel that people stay on the happy path far too much, and some of the more creative and troublesome cases don't get tested. So that's one thing. And also, the thing about it is your test design also has somewhat of a shelf life to it, because the next release will introduce new features, may take away some other features, and we know it'll probably break some features that you've already got test design for. So it's constantly changing. Okay. So those are just some basic inherent issues that we face with test design. Now, I work in all different kind of project context, traditional, agile, all different kinds. Some people can't even tell you what their methods are. They call it agile fall or wagile or whatever. But in just about any context, collaboration can help. And but here, the ticket in the door for doing this, and the ticket in the door, in my estimation, for agile, is that people have to be able to work together. They have to get along, and they have to share information. But when you can make that happen, you get some really good benefits. I don't know. I think we've all been through the situation where we faced a problem in some project or even in life itself, working on a car or trying to do something, working on a house. You hit a problem and you're trying to find a solution for it, but you realize that you need someone else to look at it too. This is what I was talking about you reach the limits of your own knowledge. So having this ability to have multiple eyes looking at the problem is huge. Also, it gives you a way to extend the knowledge to people that may not be all that familiar with the application that's being tested, as well as seeing how other people do test design. So imagine this scenario where you're bringing some new people onto your team and they're learning how you do things around your company. This is a great opportunity to show them about the applications and about how you're doing test design. And hopefully you're doing it in a good way so that you're teaching a good way, sharing a good way. If you're not in that situation, my phone number's at the end of the presentation. Give me a call. Let's talk. But anyway, it gives more ownership in the test design activity. It's not just one person's test design now, it's the team's test design. But the greater creativity in creating tests is great, as well as more objectivity when it comes to prioritizing tests. Not everything's a high priority. Some people like to think it is a high priority, but when you get a team looking at it, then you can kind of debate things and see what really truly are the high things, the moderate things, and maybe the low things. But, it's all about communication. And the more we can communicate about things, the project, the test, the problems we're solving, the better. If we don't communicate, that's where the things start to break down. We don't do things because we didn't know. No one told us, And I've seen this degrade tremendously just by having the test team or various teams, for that matter, be relocated just maybe a few hundred feet from the other team, or maybe on another story or another floor of the building. So communication is great, and face-to-face is great as well. Well, one of my Randyisms that I've said over the years is that, people get all hung up about where do we find test cases, Well, the problem isn't identifying enough test cases. There are too many. Okay. If you start really looking, you can find test cases everywhere. You can find more test cases than you could ever possibly perform. So kind of like the supermarket aisle here that I'm showing, the challenge is to identify the right test cases for you, the ones that are going to add the most value to your test, exercise the applications as rigorously as possible, and give you the information that you need. So, when someone tells me we have 10,000 test cases in our library, I'm not immediately impressed. Okay. I'll say, yeah, it's a lot of test cases. But until I start to see, well, how many of them are doing like the same thing over and over again, or the same thing in just slightly different ways, but not really very creative ways, that kind of gives me an idea of where they're at in test cases. So I start looking at the conditions, how they're combining conditions, and what those tests are actually doing. So it's not so much how many test cases you have. In fact, for those people that do say they have the 10,000 test case library, I start asking questions about what would it take to reduce that, to make your testing more efficient, to combine conditions and such. So as I mentioned, we're combining three major techniques here. And this is not, rocket science to do this or anything, but brainstorming has been around for a long, long time. And a lot of us have used it. We've heard of it if we haven't used it. But, the goal there is to just get a lot of ideas out on the board very quickly. And we'll talk more about some of the ground rules for that. But the idea is to get the information out there, then refine it. Then we're going to layer in the idea of test design to identify the various test ideas that you want to try to follow, maybe even some specific conditions that we should be thinking about in test. We could be identifying risk that we want to make sure that we cover in our testing. And then the third element that I kind of layer in here is the idea of capturing this in a mind map. Now, you can capture your ideas in a variety of ways, but I believe mind mapping gives us a way to associate things that we don't get with some of the other techniques, like just writing them in a list on a flip chart or something. And I'll show you some examples of that as well as I go along here. Now, the common misconception that I want to kind of deal with at the outset is that some people think brainstorming is just a bunch of people sitting around in a room throwing out ideas. And my experience in doing that is if that's the approach you're taking, then you're going to get a conversation typically that's dominated by maybe 2 or 3 people, and it's going to be very skewed in its makeup of what you're getting. And you're not going to get contribution from the other people because they kind of get overwhelmed by what the more dominant people are doing and saying. So there's a lot more to it than just sitting around talking about ideas. And we're going to go through that process. Now, the thing that I hope you see here is that, yes, I'm talking about test design in this webinar, but you can also apply this to a lot of other things. Like, let's say you're doing a risk assessment. One of the things you have to do is identify the risk and then assess some level of criticality or exposure to those. This can be used for a starting point there. It can be used for root cause analysis, especially good technique for that, because really what you're doing there is you're trying to throw out, well, what are some of the contributing causes to why did something happen? And you can arrive at some of those and you can eliminate some, and great technique for RCA. And then one of the things that I also use this for is to develop a test strategy. One of the very first things on a project that I like to do is to define a test strategy. You don't have to have requirements. All you have to know is the basic concept of the thing that's being built or bought and will be tested. And everyone is invited: users, testers, developers, project managers, BAs, anyone who has any perspective here. And it's really like a 1 or 2 page document that we're talking about, that we're trying to build. And I have a template for it, and we just brainstorm the items in the template. And when we're said and done, a couple of hours later, we have a test strategy. If we don't have a test strategy, we know what gaps need to be filled to complete it, because we may learn that there are some things we just don't know. So, as I mentioned, even though you can use this in just about any project context, Agile seems to get the most benefit from this, because the Agile teams tend to be co-located. They tend to they're used to the idea of collaboration and doing things quickly. Okay, so they're not kind of tied up in some of the bureaucracies that we might find with other SDLCs. Also, I find TestStorming especially helpful in designing mobile tests. By the way, I'll just mention this, that the ASTQB has recently posted an Agile certification syllabus out on their website, astqb.org. It's in beta right now, but I would invite any of you that are interested in testing mobile applications, mobile devices, to go out to the ASTQB website and download a copy of that syllabus. We're taking comments on it for about, 4 weeks, 5 weeks or so. And we would love to get feedback from people who are out in the field doing mobile testing. One of the things you'll see mentioned in that syllabus is TestStorming. I was a contributing author to it, and to me, it's a great way to think of tests for things that are very, very undefined, like you would see in a mobile application. Also, if you're doing acceptance testing, where you're not basing it on requirements or use cases or anything, but you're basing it on real-world user activities, that can be good. Any kind of risk-based testing typically can be helped by TestStorming. And then when you get into the technical kind of test, like security testing or performance testing, those especially can benefit from having subject matter experts, technical experts, contributing ideas and factors for the test that we need to consider. Now, I'm going to take a break here, look at the chat window again to see if anyone has any questions at this point. And I don't see anything in there just yet. So that's cool. If you have one, just pop it in there. Okay. So to do this process, and to do it at least, I'm tempted to say correctly, but to do it effectively, okay, might be a better way to say this. You need a good facilitator to be the leader for the meeting itself. And ideally, it's someone who is trained to be a facilitator, especially in the brainstorming type of sessions. In some ways, this kind of looks and feels like a review session, but it's really not. I mean, in a review session, you're looking for something in something else. In this kind of session, you're trying to get as many ideas out as you can. So you need someone who can kind of sometimes quiet some people down and pull out from other people, okay? And a good facilitator can do that. They can kind of prime the pump for ideas. You also need people who are knowledgeable and creative, who are not afraid to put their ideas out there. We don't shoot them down, okay? But they, at the end of the game, their ideas may not win. And so they need to have that ability to be able to throw stuff up against the wall, and if it doesn't stick, fine, okay? It was just an idea. We're brainstorming. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you have to be able to work with others, collaborate with others, but you also need a way to capture the ideas very quickly and a way to format those ideas, such as I mentioned before, in a mind map, and I'm also going to show you another option as well. Now, for mind mapping, this is another technique that's been around for a long, long time. You can basically use a piece of paper for this. In fact, sometimes when I take notes of sessions, I will just mind map it. You can use a whiteboard, flip chart, those kind of things, but there are some great open source tools that will help you do this. My favorite is FreeMind, because it gives you a chance to annotate with some symbols of what you're putting on there on your chart. Another free one is Xmind. Both of these work either on Windows or Mac. I believe in Linux as well. They're both open source. But with mind mapping, your idea is to start working through topics, okay? Then develop subtopics, then develop maybe tests off of those. Now, the advantage of using a tool approach versus just a whiteboard or a flip chart or something like that is that you can distribute the information a lot easier. Also, you can save it. You don't risk someone erasing it during lunch or ripping the page off and throwing it away or something like that. And plus you can update it and maintain it, which is a lot harder to do if you're using just a whiteboard or paper-based approach. So here's a mind map that I created in FreeMind using a little contact management application as the basis of what I was testing here, called Time and Chaos. And let me get my pen going here. You'll notice here that, there we go. Like one of the major areas we would test would be contacts. And then we've kind of listed out the various functions like add contact, edit contact, delete contact. And you'll see that we've given them priorities, 1, 3, 4, 2. And also, there's little like dashboard items you can put in there too, like the red stoplight over here. On appointments, we have a yellow light to show that there might be something going on there. Maybe some tests are failing. So you can create a mind map like this, and then you can start, branching off of this with maybe specific test ideas. And you can go as deep as you want on this, okay? And it's in a nice, neat, clean format. Once again, totally free, open source. And I give you the links here on where you can download those. Now, let's talk about the roles for just a minute. The facilitator is really the key person in this, because you can have a great group of people in there, but unless you have someone who can keep the session on track and make sure that you're meeting the objectives you're trying to get at, then you're not going to see the effectiveness in the session. So just like in reviews, the facilitator, they're there to facilitate, not to inject themselves into the session. Sure, they can suggest some ideas now and then, but they certainly shouldn't dominate the session. They're just there to keep the meeting on track and to keep the flow of ideas coming. The other key role is the recorder. Someone needs to be there to capture the ideas, and they have to be able to do it very quickly. That's why the facilitator typically isn't very well equipped to do both facilitation and to record the ideas. So the recorder can kind of help on that. Now, a few ground rules on the sessions, just to be sure that you don't get off onto a bad foot here, is that, first of all, there are no bad ideas, okay? Well, actually there are, but we're not going to call them bad at the outset, okay? We're going to put everyone's ideas on the list, and we're not going to reject anything. We're not going to say, oh, that's stupid, that won't work. You know, we're not going to do that. We'll vote and we'll combine, and believe me, the good ideas will float to the top, okay? Everyone contributes. If not, then they shouldn't be in the meeting, okay? It's kind of like, I think Patton used to say that if everyone's thinking the same way, then somebody's not thinking, you know? So everyone contributes. If someone is not contributing, it's up to the facilitator to ask that person, well, what ideas do you have, you know? And we don't get into personal criticisms, once again, like calling an idea stupid or bad or something. And we also have a limited time frame we do this in, okay? You're not going to sit there all day and do this. Really, 2 hours at maximum. Most of the sessions I do are 1 hour sessions or less. Generally speaking, most cases, you can get the information you need and get a good start on your test design with a fairly limited amount of time. Now, in getting started, I want you to understand that the process I'm going to lay out here is just a process, okay? It's one that's worked for me very well, but like I just said about test design in general, you may have to tweak it for your own situations. I'm not going to read off this slide. This is kind of a roadmap slide, but there are 9 steps in the basic process, but then there's a couple of follow-up steps after the session as you actually start to perform the test and make adjustments. You see, what looks good in a brainstorming session, once you start actually trying to perform those tests, as we've all probably seen, you'll find some flaws in what you've done there. Okay, I'm going to take a look to see, are there any questions at this point? Okay, it looks like we are still doing pretty good. Up to this point, we have 29 people. Wow. I didn't even know the meeting would hold that many. Okay. Anyway, let us proceed. I just like to keep a check to see how we're doing. Okay. Now, the first big thing we have to decide is how we're going to capture the input. Okay. And the tools I mentioned, FreeMind and XMind, are one option. They're very easy to use. They can help you capture that information very quickly. The screenshot you're seeing down here is from XMind. Okay, I'd shown you one earlier from FreeMind. You could use Word, okay, if you want to just create kind of a text list of notes. You could also use spreadsheets. And what I'm going to show you in a couple of slides here is one that a friend of mine, Greg Pascal, developed called METS, which I really, really like a lot. You can also use the whiteboard and flip charts, but as we mentioned, those do have some obvious drawbacks. So the METS strategy was developed by Greg Pascal, and his website is gregpascal.com. And I think you may have to do a little bit of searching within it to find these spreadsheets. If you can't find them out there, dash me off an email, and I will I'll give you the download link, or what I might just do is just include it with the other stuff that I post, and that way you'll have it there. But the last time I checked his website, the METS links weren't very pronounced there. But anyway, the way this works is this is an Excel spreadsheet, of course. And you have columns here for, first of all, a category of things, and then the 4 to the right are the levels of risk or criticality. You have critical, high, medium, and low. And the physical test grid, you know, to me, this is something that was way ahead of its time, because he developed this probably 10 or more years ago. And the idea here is that the physical test grid are the things that you can touch, you can access with a mouse, you can click on, you can, like on a mobile device, you can scroll with your fingers, things you can touch, okay? So things like displays, maybe that the display completes loading would be a critical item. Loads in a reasonable amount of time might be a high item. It's consistent between device brands and versions. Okay, so you're seeing here kind of the mobile application of this. And this would be a great thing to brainstorm, okay? You'll have your categories. Okay, say our goal is to come up with the things we want to test at the critical, high, medium, and low levels of the display, the graphics, and the forms for this web device. Okay, or I'm sorry, for this mobile device, and have people start to suggest things. Down here in the forms, you'll see things like the menus are functional, the buttons are functional, check boxes are functional, and so forth. And you could probably fill out one of these sheets in less than an hour. Now, the other side of this is the functional test grid. And this is the functionality that is invoked by the physical items. So you'll see here the categories look a little different, like accounts, shopping cart, product catalog, transactional, search. And the things that are in here, some of them are posed as questions, some are not, but some of them well, it looks like in this one, I've posed a lot of these as questions. So in accounts, creating an account is possible. Logging into account is possible. Can the user change account details, such as shipping addresses? All these have different levels of criticality and would be great to brainstorm and test storm as you're going through here. So the second thing that you have to do is you have to define what your scope is. Super important, because if your scope is too big, you won't have time to cover it all. If it's too narrow, you won't have enough input. So you want to both define the amount of time your session will be and which features you're going to try to address in the session. And then you want to define the focus of the session, like maybe it's a particular area of interest, a particular reason, maybe a problem you're trying to solve. Like I give the example here, the focus of a test storming session might be the security aspects of a mobile device. Or it could even be more precise than that. It could be to design tests for the secure ordering process using a mobile device. And then you need the facilitator. Once again, without it, you can drift into the weeds. So you want the facilitator there to make sure everyone's contributing. So they may have to inject some ideas or remarks of their own. This is kind of I guess a call, that each company makes on their own. But I think that usually the best facilitators are people that do have some subject matter knowledge of the thing that's being tested, as well as test knowledge. Because they know the test knowledge gives the facilitator the ability to know, are we getting the right things to test, etc. The subject matter knowledge kind of keeps an eye on, does this make sense in the thing that we're testing? They should also be able to lead dynamic group discussions, which means they can deal with disputes, keep the session on track, especially if people start drifting off into other side conversations and topics. And then you need to invite the participants. Now, just like reviews or retrospectives or anything like that, the quality of the session depends on the quality of the people in the room. You want people who are creative thinkers, also critical thinkers. They know about the context of how that application will be used. They know what the organization wants to do with the application. What are the big business goals? Now, this is especially true for mobile apps and for web apps. What is the value to the organization to have this application working right? They need to understand the different types of users that may be using the application. And these people should know something about test design, in that you want people who can think of tests in a way that, not just the happy path way once again, but just people who can come up with those things that you would think, who would ever try to do that kind of thing. And then also you want people who are generally courteous and can get along and work in a team environment. But ultimately they're able to contribute ideas. If they can't do that, then they're really not needed in the session. You may also want to identify by role, like testers, developers, users, BAs, those kind of folks. Now, let me check for questions. Okay. David asked, is this similar to risk-based testing preparation? You can use it for that, especially for the, when you're using the METS sheets, you can use it for risk-based test planning. That was one of the alternate context that we mentioned there at the outset, that you could actually do that. So the answer is yes. It's very similar to that. Now, the gathering input in the session, we're still in the step now to conduct the session. There's a lot of different ways you can approach this. One is to pose some questions to the group. Jerry Weinberg calls these context-free questions, and they're really great because you can apply them to anything that you're working on. But what are the most important things to be tested? What are the least important? Where is the risk in the features to be tested? What unusual things could occur? Which events would be most commonly performed by the average user? In other words, sometimes you may want to really define the happy path and then to know how far off you can get from that. Another thing you can do is have each person at the outset write their top 5 things they would like to see tested on index cards or sticky notes or something. And then the leader will use that as kind of an input to, once again, get the discussion started of some conditions to test. Or you could do a round robin approach where you simply go around the room and start making suggestions, and you continue until people pretty much run out of ideas. Now, I'm going to show you an alternate approach to even that here before we get done. So I have an error on my slide. Let me do an agile presentation trick for you real quick. That's the way this is supposed to be. Okay, so question is, how would this look? Okay, and you know what? I wish I had a video of one of the sessions that I've conducted on this, but instead I've come up with this kind of lame cartoon. But anyway, so we see the facilitator here, and they're saying our goal is to test the account setup function. Okay, so one person may immediately chime in and say, well, what if the same person sets up 2 different accounts? And then the other person kind of adds on to that and says, and if they use the same email address. Okay, another person may say, well, how long does it take for a user to set up an account? And another person might ask, well, are non-US accounts allowed? Another person may kind of chime in, well, what happens if someone wants to cancel their currently active account? And then another person might say in a way, well, it depends if they're a mobile or a desktop user and how we're going to do this. So which one are we going to focus on, one or the other? And so you kind of see this back and forth going on. Now, that's why the mind map and those kind of techniques are so important, is because each one of these concerns can be kind of associated with the general idea of setting up an account. Okay, so the multi-person setup, the non-US account, the cancellation, the performance of how long it takes, the type of user, mobile or desktop, all those could be associated in a mind map, and you could build on those going even further. Now, you keep this process going until basically you can kind of tell that, okay, the good ideas have kind of stopped flowing and we're not really thinking of anything else. Then in step 7 is where the magic really starts to happen, is where you filter, refine, and combine these ideas into the things you want to test. And so right now, you have this raw input that you've achieved. And now the facilitator and the team all take a step back and kind of look at what's now been thrown out there. And you might kind of categorize things such as functions, or maybe by risk, or perhaps by user personas. And you get an idea of now what's bubbling up to the top. What's the most important thing? What's the most effective kind of test? One of the things that you'll probably wind up doing is eliminating some of the ideas. You may combine and enhance others. But one of the favorite things that I like to do in test design is what I call toggling. So, if someone suggests trying to test a new customer placing an order, what about a condition for an existing customer placing an order? Or maybe canceling an order if they're placing an order, that kind of thing. So you take one idea and you start playing off of that one idea, but you play in opposite and alternate directions. Now, we conclude the session in step 8. And at this point, the facilitator does a brief recap of what was suggested. They don't read through all the ideas, but they kind of recap some things and summarize some things. And then the input that was created during the session gets emailed to the team and to other people. If you're using a tool, then you can save that chart, and you can either have it in a format that can be updated, or you can just send it out in an image format. And then at that point, you're ready now to take this and start refining these as test cases or test scripts or scenarios, whatever you use. That might be a good set of test documentation that you can use. Now, in some Agile teams, you may go directly into automation, So the output, another way to see this might be a checklist of things, or maybe a defect taxonomy that you would want to try to base it on. But regardless of the amount of detail that you obtain from the session, you're eventually going to want to build on this into some kind of executable test case with ideally some expected results. Or as I say on the slide here, or whatever format your organizations use. Now, I also put the caveat in here. In some situations, you may not know enough about the application to define expected results. So you may have to kind of use this as a starting point for exploratory testing as well, which wouldn't be a bad thing either. So when the tests are created and you feel like you have a good basis to start from, then you can actually perform some of the tests and to know if they're actually going to be effective or not, if they're actually going to work. Remember, I said this is kind of a nuanced thing, and I can remember some sessions that I've been in where we had some really great ideas in the brainstorming session itself and in the test storming of creating tests with those. And I would look at those and say, I'm not sure that's going to scale, or I'm not sure that we want to commit ourselves to documenting the test at this amount of detail. It's okay for a few tests, but I don't think we can keep it up for hundreds of tests, And we didn't really confirm that until we started to actually pilot and perform a few of those tests. So you're not so much concerned if the tests are passing or failing, but are they something you can commit to, and do they exercise the application that really gives you some good information? And typically you can tell that in the first few of these tests that you actually start to perform. Now, after performing a few of these tests, you'll have a feel for, if these are what you want to include in future tests, or you may want to build upon these for other tests. But you'll also many times see where they need to be modified to be a little bit more effective in finding the failures, which could be defects. Now, so I can leave just a few minutes for questions here. I want to be sure I get to this one. This is a really cool variation on this process, and it kind of extends test storming into exploratory testing. And I stumbled across it one time because I had to teach exploratory testing, but the students in the class didn't have computers. Okay. And I was the only one in the classroom with the ability to show the application, to use and show the application. So what I did was I just projected the application from my computer onto a screen, and I put the group in a circle. We had about probably 15 or so people in the class. And starting at my left, we went around the circle, and I said, here's the only rule. I said, you can suggest anything you want for me to try on this application, but the person after you has to build on the previous person's test, what they suggested. So it's like the old game of 20 questions, right? And so we went one round, and I would try things. And as we were trying things, as I would try things that people would suggest, we saw quite a few things that were questionable, that were defects. Some things were just very, very odd behavior. And we actually went around 2 or 3 times the room doing that. And people got very excited to see that, yeah, once I start thinking about all the things that actually could be done, I don't need a requirement. Okay. I can actually start exercising the application in some very creative ways here. So, just to kind of summarize before we take some questions, there is a lot of power in collaboration, and test design is one thing that greatly benefits from group interaction. So think of test storming as where test design meets brainstorming to come up with these creative and effective tests. But you need a good facilitator, good participants, and a way to capture the input from multiple people. But thankfully, we have some great tools for that. But the rest is up to you to get your team's their creative juices flowing and to put that to work for you. So with that, I am going to pop out of here back to the chat window and take any questions that anyone might have. I went about 5 minutes over my target mark of 45 minutes. But does anyone have any questions they'd like to raise at this point? I did see a comment here. I'm sorry, I failed to mention. I don't know if you guys saw it from Steve in Middleton. He said, I didn't realize how applicable this could be to the concept of context-driven testing that I'm socializing here at work. Technique seems like a great tool for leveraging context or for leverage context-driven test design. Yeah, it really is. I think there's a lot of shared space in there. Sure do, Steve. Okay, thanks for the comment, Violet. Didn't see or hear anything that was not clarified by your commentary. That's always good news. It's always good when I leave the presentation without confusing people. That's kind of my goal, is to not inject any more confusion. Okay. LD from Georgia asked, can you walk us through a METS example? Sure, I'd be happy to do that real quickly. Let's go back up here for a second. I realize I went through this kind of quickly, but once again, the key to understanding METS is that you have two layers. You have the physical, and you also have the functional. Now, I'm going to do something here that drive people nuts sometimes, and that is there's also a characteristics side of this, but also there's a metric side of this. Now, I didn't show this slide, but you can actually associate estimates with each of those tests, and this is part of the spreadsheet. I didn't show you that, so let me take a copy of that and put it in the presentation I just made, and that will be helpful to you, I think, also. Anyway, to answer this question of the example, let's go back to the physical test grid for just a moment, and let's look at graphics. So the context here is a mobile device. And so we want to, it's critical that the graphics load completely. Let's say you're dealing with a mapping function, okay? You can, realize we're not talking about function here at this point. We're talking about these are the enablers of the functionality. These are the things that you touch. So a graphic loading completely, I can't click on something or I can't touch something or swipe something if that image doesn't load completely. The other aspect of that is that the graphic completes loading within a consistent time frame. So if I'm on a mobile device and the graphics don't load very quickly, then I'm going to get very frustrated and just go to someone else's application. They're consistent in loading every time. Okay, so like if I have a product page or something that I'm showing to someone on a mobile device, they see the same type of image each and every time, and that the graphics can load in low bandwidth conditions. A great test for mobile devices. So if I go into like 3G coverage or extended level of cell coverage, I can still get the graphics to load. They may be a little slower. People normally expect that when they're in those lower areas. So this would be an example of taking one aspect of graphics, the loading of the graphics, and taking it from the critical down to the low. Okay. Now, if we go into the functional aspect of this, I think maybe the shopping cart might be something. Can an item be placed into the cart? That's critical. Now, that sounds really common sense, doesn't it? I was on a website the other day trying to buy something, and it physically would not let me put the item into the cart. I tried every way I could. I told my wife, I said, gee, that's bad for business. You know, you can't even place items into the cart. I think it was a browser compatibility issue, but yeah, you know what? I didn't want to mess with it. So I just bought it somewhere else. But anyway, just asking the question, can an item be placed into a cart? That's an obvious thing, should be possible, but it's also highly critical. And then the other highly critical thing is, can we remove an item from the cart? When we get into the high levels, can we put multiple items into the cart? And does the cart reflect removed items correctly? And can more than one item be removed at a time? These are high level things. And then the medium level things, do items consistently carry through the purchase session? Now, I might actually move that up to a high, but you know, are removed items affecting the subtotal, total, or tax? I think that's also a fairly important one, because you don't want the item still adding into your total or tax or something like that. And it's a very common error, a common defect in shopping cart software, where you know, just because the item is not appearing in your cart doesn't mean that it's actually been taken away from the total tax or shipping or anything. And at the low is the tax being calculated correctly. Now, some people could argue that would be critical, because if you get that one wrong, now you're out of compliance and you're paying penalties and all that. So, you know, it does point out, though, that people may debate and discuss at which level of criticality things should be in a METS grid like this. But, and then once again, you can take all those things that were in both grids, and you can show their categories, their importance, and the time required, as well as the potential severity, and come up with an estimate of what that test might look like. So that's about the quickest example that I can show you there, LD, and I hope that helps a little bit. Okay, well, we are right at the 1 o'clock mark. I haven't seen just a whole lot of questions popping in here, so I think we're probably at the end of our session. Hey, I appreciate you guys all showing up. I appreciate your support. I hope to do another one of these later this month. It's probably going to be on the mobile testing syllabus that I mentioned earlier, and just generally on mobile testing in general. So I'm not going to promise that's going to be the topic, but that's the one that I'm thinking about doing at this point. So anyway, thanks everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend. And I really appreciate you guys being here. So I'll see you next time. Thank you all.